What if a language existed that you could only read once? Not because the text disappeared after reading. Not because the words were erased or the page was burned or the document was destroyed by the person who wrote it, but because the act of reading it, the single, specific, unrepeatable event of your eyes moving across those particular symbols in that particular order for the very first time, changed you in a way that made it impossible to read them again. Not impossible in the sense of difficult. Impossible in the sense that after the first reading, you were no longer the person who could read it. The reading used you up. The language required a reader who had not yet encountered it, and once you had encountered it, that reader was gone, replaced by someone different, someone altered, someone who now carried the text inside them rather than in front of them. And what if that change, that irreversible alteration produced by a single reading, was not a side effect but the point? What if the language was not a system for transmitting information from one mind to another, the way all languages we know are, but a system for transmitting the reader from one state to another? What if it was not a message but a mechanism? Not a thing that said something but a thing that did something, the way a key does something, the way a door does something, the way stepping through a threshold does something that cannot be undone because once you are on the other side, the side you came from is behind you and the concept of return requires a self that no longer exists. Professor Callum Reid spent 31 years studying languages. He had spent his career at the edges of linguistic knowledge, the places where language broke down, where the systems failed, where the known tongues of humanity ran out and something else began. He had studied dying languages and dead languages and languages so old that the people who spoke them were geological strata rather than memories. He had spent time with constructed languages, with sign languages, with the proto-languages that modern linguistics can partially reconstruct from the shared remnants of their descendants. He had never found what he was looking for, until room 7 of the Aldersham Hotel, in the market town of Aldersham, Shropshire, England, on the night of November 19, 2022, showed it to him. He read it once. Then he was gone. This is his story. This is the story of the language that only works once. This is the story of the writing on the wall and the man who spent his life learning to read and finally, on a cold November night in a room above a pub in the English Midlands, read the one thing that mattered. We don't know what it said. We only know what it did. Part 1. The town that time kept meaning to leave. Aldersham sits in the Shropshire countryside approximately 14 miles northeast of Shrewsbury, in a fold of agricultural land between two low hills that give the town a sheltered, cupped quality. The sense of a place that has been held in the same hands for a very long time and shows the warmth of that holding in the color of its stone and the depth of its lanes. It is a market town in the old sense. A place that existed to serve the agricultural community around it, that grew up around the weekly market that has been held in its central square since 1247, that defines itself by its function rather than its beauty, though it has plenty of the latter. The Aldersham Hotel sits on the north side of the market square. It is not a grand hotel. It has 11 rooms, a bar that serves food until 9 and drinks until 11, a small breakfast room that also serves as a function room for the occasional local event, and a reputation for reliable comfort that it has maintained, with minor variations in quality, for approximately 200 years. The current owners, a couple named James and Patricia Hollowell who took it over from Patricia's parents in 2009, run it with the pragmatic warmth of people who have chosen hospitality as a vocation rather than a business, which is a distinction that guests consistently notice and appreciate. Room 7 is on the second floor, at the end of the corridor, overlooking the back garden rather than the market square. It is the largest of the hotel's rooms, with a sitting area in addition to the bedroom, a Victorian fireplace that still functions, and 2 tall sash windows that look out over a walled garden where, in summer, guests sometimes take their breakfast. In November, the garden is bare and brown and still, and the light through the windows is the particular gray gold of an English autumn afternoon, melancholy and beautiful in equal measure. Room 7 has been occupied by hundreds of guests over the years. It has no particular history that the Hollowells are aware of, No notable previous guests, no remarkable events, no local legends attached to it. It is simply the best room in a good small hotel, and it is the room that Professor Callum Reid booked for 3 nights when he came to Aldersham in November 2022. He checked in on the evening of November 17th. He was gone by the morning of November 20th. Between those dates, something happened in room 7 that the Hollowells have spent 2 years trying to understand, and that the Shropshire Police, West Mercia Police, and the National Crime Agency have collectively filed under a classification that amounts, in plain English, to "we have no idea." Part 2. The Professor at the Edge of Language. Callum Reid was 63 years old at the time of his disappearance. He held the chair of historical linguistics at the University of Edinburgh, a position he had occupied for 18 years, and he was by any measure a distinguished scholar, the author of 7 academic books, the recipient of fellowships from the British Academy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the kind of professor whose graduate students went on to populate linguistics departments across the English-speaking world and who invariably described him, in interviews and memoirs and the occasional obituary written prematurely by well-meaning colleagues, as the most rigorous and the most genuinely curious mind they had ever encountered in academic life. Rigor and curiosity. These are the 2 words that appear most consistently in descriptions of Callum Reid. They seem, at first, like natural companions. Of course, a good scholar is both rigorous and curious, the one quality disciplining the other into productive research rather than mere speculation. But in practice, in the actual lived experience of an academic career, rigor and curiosity are frequently in tension. Rigor wants to stay within the established boundaries of the knowable. Curiosity keeps pointing at the boundary and asking what is on the other side. Callum had spent his career managing this tension, and managing it productively. His published work was impeccably rigorous, methodologically beyond reproach, cited by scholars who had no interest in the more speculative dimensions of his thinking. But in his private research, in the notebooks recovered from his Edinburgh flat after his disappearance, in the research files on his university computer, in the correspondence with a small number of trusted colleagues who understood what he was actually looking for beneath the respectable surface of his academic output, the curiosity had always been pointing at something specific. He was looking for what he called, in a private notebook entry from 2009, the original language. Not the proto-language that academic linguistics posits as the common ancestor of human tongues. That was a scholarly construct, a hypothetical reconstruction, the linguistic equivalent of a fossil. He was looking for something older, something that predated the divergence of human languages from a common source. Something that was not a human language at all in the sense that it had not been developed by humans but had been discovered by them. Found, the way mathematics is found rather than invented, already existing in the structure of things, waiting to be named. He believed, and this belief grew stronger and more specific over the 31 years of his career, tracking a thread through obscure texts and marginal annotations and the oral traditions of indigenous communities that had maintained knowledge of very old things, that this original language was not lost, that it had never been lost, that it existed in fragments in specific physical locations, inscribed in materials that predated any known writing system, in a script that no existing decipherment methodology could crack because it was not a script in any conventional sense. Not a system for encoding the sounds of speech or the concepts of thought, but a system for producing a direct effect on the consciousness of the reader. A language that did not represent experience but generated it. A language that was not about something but did something. A mechanism, not a message. He had been looking for a complete example of this language his entire career. In the autumn of 2022, a letter arrived at his Edinburgh office that changed everything. Part 3. The letter. The letter was handwritten on plain cream paper, in an envelope with a Shropshire postmark and no return address. The handwriting was old-fashioned in style, the kind of careful copperplate that was taught in British schools until the mid-20th century, and that has largely vanished from the hands of anyone born after 1960. Callum was not born after 1960, and he recognized the style immediately. It was the handwriting of a person of his own generation or older, someone who had been taught to write with a care and deliberateness that the age of keyboards had rendered largely unnecessary. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph identified the writer as a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Ellison, who had lived in Aldersham for 40 years and who had, during a routine redecoration of Room 7 at the Aldersham Hotel, discovered something beneath the Victorian wallpaper that she believed might be of interest to someone with Professor Reed's specialization. She had been helping the Hollowells with the redecoration. She was a long-standing friend of the family, and she had been the person who stripped the section of wall beside the Victorian fireplace where the old paper had been lifting at the edges for years. Beneath the paper on the plaster was writing. Not graffiti. Not names or dates or the casual marks left by bored occupants of a room over the years. Writing. Dense, organized, systematic, in a script that Margaret Ellison, who had spent 40 years teaching English and who had a hobbyist's interest in history and antiquities, did not recognize at all. Not Latin. Not any European script she could identify. Not anything she had ever seen in any book or museum or church in 40 years of living in one of England's most historically rich counties. The second paragraph of the letter said simply, "I am not a scholar and I do not know what this is. But I know that it is something and I believe it is very old and I thought you should know about it. I hope this does not seem presumptuous. I found your name in a book my late husband owned, and your address at the university from their website. Forgive me for writing without introduction." Callum Reed read the letter on a Thursday morning in October 2022. He replied the same day, requesting photographs. Margaret Ellison, who did not have a smartphone but did have a friend with one, sent him 12 images of the writing the following week. He looked at those images for 3 days before he responded. His reply, when it came, was very short. "I will come to Aldersham. Please do not let anyone photograph the writing further, and please do not attempt to clean or treat the plaster. I will be there in November." His private notes from that 3-day period of study, recovered later from his laptop, contain one entry that is not analysis. Everything else is measurement and comparison and careful scholarly notation. But on the 3rd day, between a detailed examination of the script's stroke patterns and a comparison with known pre-Roman inscription styles, he wrote, "I think this is it. I think this is actually it. After 31 years, I think Margaret Ellison found it stripping wallpaper in a hotel room in Shropshire, and I am trying very hard not to be the kind of person who allows himself to believe that before he has seen it with his own eyes." He booked room 7 for 3 nights in November. Part 4, the first 2 days. Callum arrived in Aldersham on the evening of November 17th and was met in the hotel bar by James Hollowell, Margaret Ellison, and a cautious excitement that everyone present was trying professionally to manage. James Hollowell was a practical man who was primarily concerned about the structural implications of whatever was on his wall. Margaret Ellison was a careful woman who was primarily concerned with having done the right thing by contacting an expert. Callum Reed was a 63-year-old scholar who had spent his entire professional life looking for something and had spent 3 weeks trying not to believe he had found it. He spent the first evening in the bar, drinking a single glass of red wine and asking Margaret Ellison careful questions about the discovery. Exactly which section of wall, exactly how the paper had been lifted, exactly what the condition of the plaster was, whether it had been wet or dry, whether there had been any smell, any unusual temperature. Margaret answered everything with the precise recall of a former teacher accustomed to being accurate. She had the impression, she said, that the writing had been done in a single session, not added to over time, not the work of multiple hands, but a single extended piece of writing produced by one person in one sitting, because the line weight and the pressure were consistent throughout, and the spacing was consistent, and there was a continuity to it that spoke of a single uninterrupted act. Callum went to room 7 at 10 o'clock that evening, carrying his equipment, notebooks, measuring tools, a high-resolution camera, portable lighting, and he did not come down again until 8 the next morning. James Hollowell, who was up at 6 for the breakfast preparation, heard him moving in the room at that hour, footsteps, the occasional sound of equipment being repositioned, once the low sound of what might have been Callum talking to himself or into a recording device. Nothing alarming. The sounds of a scholar at work. At breakfast, Callum ate everything on his plate and drank 2 cups of coffee and was, by James's account, in a state of barely contained elation that he was managing with the discipline of a man who had learned over a long career not to celebrate before the work was done. He said the writing was extraordinary. He said it was unlike anything in any known corpus of inscriptions. He said the script was consistent with a pre-Roman date but inconsistent with any known pre-Roman writing system used in Britain. He said the language, if it was a language which he believed it was, appeared to be complete. Not a fragment, not a partial inscription, but a whole text, beginning and ending on the same section of wall with the internal coherence of a finished statement. He said he needed 1 more day before he could begin a serious decipherment attempt. Margaret Ellison asked him if he thought he could read it. He paused. He looked at his coffee. He said, "I think it may not be a question of whether I can read it. I think it may be a question of whether it will let itself be read. And I think I need to understand the difference before I try." Nobody was entirely sure what he meant by this. Nobody asked him to clarify, because there was something in the way he said it that did not invite clarification. He went back to room 7 after breakfast. He spent the second day the same way as the first, in the room, working, coming down briefly for meals, returning immediately. That evening at dinner he was quieter, more internal. The elation of the first day had settled into something else. A deeper, more serious focus, the way a climber gets serious when the summit comes into view and the nature of the challenge becomes finally, fully clear. Patricia Hollowell asked him over dinner how it was going. He said, "I know what it is. I spent today making sure. Tomorrow I'm going to read it." She asked him what it was. He thought for a moment. Then, "It's a door. Someone wrote a door on that wall and plastered over it and put wallpaper on top, and for God knows how many years it's been sitting there waiting for someone who could open it." Patricia laughed, a little uncertainly, because she could not tell whether he was being metaphorical. He was not smiling. He went back to room 7 at 9 o'clock. He did not come down again. Part 5. The morning of November 20th. At 7:15 on the morning of November 20th, James Hollowell knocked on the door of room 7 to let the professor know that breakfast would be ready in 30 minutes. There was no response. He knocked again. Still nothing. He tried the handle. The door was unlocked, and opened it. The room was empty. Not in the way a room is empty when the occupant has stepped out. In the way a room is empty when no one has been in it for a while. A specific stillness, a particular quality of undisturbed air, that anyone who has spent time in hotels learns to recognize. The bed had been slept in, or at least lain on, the covers were turned back on one side. The equipment was on the desk. Notebooks, camera, measuring tools, the portable lighting, exactly as it had been each morning when James had seen it. Callum's personal items, his wallet, his phone, his reading glasses, his laptop, his coat were all present. His shoes were by the door. He was not in the bathroom. He was not in the corridor. He was not anywhere in the hotel, which James checked thoroughly over the following 30 minutes, trying to maintain the calm of a hotelier who has dealt with difficult situations before and knows that panic is never useful. He called the police at 8 o'clock. The Shropshire police arrived within the hour. They conducted a search of the premises and the surrounding area, the walled garden, the market square, the streets immediately adjacent to the hotel. They found nothing. No Callum Reed, no evidence of how he had left, no evidence that he had left voluntarily or involuntarily. The room showed no signs of a struggle. The window latches were fastened from the inside. The door had been unlocked, not forced, which meant either Callum had left through it and someone had relocked it from outside, which is mechanically impossible for that type of lock, or the door had simply been unlocked and Callum had not left through it. The CCTV camera in the hotel corridor showed nothing. Not because it had been tampered with or disabled. Because nothing had happened in that corridor between 9:07 p.m., when Callum was captured on camera returning to his room, and 7:16 a.m., when James was captured on camera knocking on the door. For 10 hours and 9 minutes, the corridor outside room 7 was empty of any movement. The door did not open. Nobody went in. Nobody came out. Callum Reid was in the room at 9:07 p.m. He was not in the room at 7:16 a.m. The door did not open in between. Part 6. The writing. The writing on the wall of room 7 was formally documented by the forensic team, photographed in multiple spectra, measured, sampled, and the documentation was submitted to 4 separate academic institutions for analysis: the University of Edinburgh's Linguistics Department, the British Museum's Department of Ancient Inscriptions, the Oxford Centre for the Study of Ancient Documents, and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. All 4 institutions returned the same finding, with varying degrees of scholarly hedging. The script was unknown. Not unknown in the sense of familiar but undeciphered, the way linear A is unknown, a recognized system waiting for a key. Unknown in the more fundamental sense of unparalleled. No existing catalog of writing systems, ancient or modern, conventional or marginal, contained anything that matched the structural and graphological properties of the Aldersham inscription. It was not related to any known writing system. It had not developed from any known writing system. It was not a regional variant or an eccentric derivative of anything in the corpus. It was simply something that had never been seen before by any of the scholars who looked at it, and the collective experience of those scholars represented several centuries of accumulated expertise in ancient writing systems. What the scholars could say, with varying degrees of confidence, was this: the inscription was old. The carbon dating of the organic pigment used, a carbon-based ink applied directly to the plaster, returned a date range of 1100 to 1300 CE, which placed it in the high medieval period, centuries before the current hotel building was constructed on what had presumably been an earlier structure. The ink had been applied to plaster that was itself of medieval composition. The text was, at minimum, 700 years old. It was approximately 200 characters long. 200 distinct symbols, organized into what appeared to be 17 lines of irregular length, with consistent spacing and directionality, reading left to right in the manner of most European scripts. The symbols were neither pictographic nor purely abstract. They sat in a middle register, each one carrying what a graphic analyst described as a quality of compressed meaning, as if each symbol were doing the work that a sentence would normally require. Callum Reid's working notes from his 2 days with the inscription, recovered from his notebooks and his laptop, represent the most sustained analysis of the text that exists. They are remarkable documents: 46 pages of handwritten notes and 38 pages of typed analysis, moving from graphological survey through structural analysis through an increasingly careful and increasingly personal account of a scholar arriving at the edge of something he can measure but cannot fully contain within his methodology. His structural analysis found that the inscription was organized as a sequence. Not a list, not a description, not a narrative in any conventional sense, but a sequence. A series of symbols that built on each other with the cumulative logic of a mathematical proof or a piece of music, each unit depending on and extending what preceded it, the whole structure pointing toward a conclusion that existed in the 17th line. He could not read the conclusion, not because the symbols were unclear, because, he wrote, the conclusion of this text is not in the text. The text is a preparation. The last symbol is not a word or a concept or an instruction. It is a threshold. The text prepares the reader to cross something. What they cross into is not written here because it cannot be written. You cannot write the other side of a door on the door itself. He underlined this passage 3 times. He added, below it, tomorrow I am going to cross it. Part 7. What was left behind. Callum Reid left 4 things in room 7 that require specific attention. The first was his notebook open on the desk to the final entry. The entry was dated November 19th, timed at 11:47 p.m., and it was the last thing he wrote. It read, "I have been preparing for this my entire career without knowing I was preparing for it. Every language I studied was a step toward this one. Every dead tongue, every extinct system, every marginal script in every neglected archive was part of a preparation I did not understand I was undertaking. The text on this wall is the most complete thing I have ever read. It is the only thing I have ever read that knew it was being read. It read me back. Tomorrow I finish it, whatever that means." The second was his phone on the bedside table with a single unsent text message in the drafts folder. The message was addressed to his daughter, Eleanor, who lives in Glasgow and who was, until this moment, the only person he had told about the Aldersham inscription. The unsent message read, "Elle, I think I understand now what your mother meant when she said she wasn't afraid. I think she could see something the rest of us couldn't yet. I think I can see it now too. Don't worry about me. I know that's impossible to ask. Ask it anyway. I love you, Dad." Callum's wife, Miriam, had died of cancer 4 years earlier. Eleanor has read this message many times. She has never spoken publicly about it except once, in a brief statement to the police. "He was the most rational person I have ever known. He did not say things he did not mean. He was not confused or distressed or frightened. He was telling me something was okay. I am choosing to believe him." The third thing was a single page of notes separate from the notebook on plain hotel paper. It was a translation, or the beginning of one, 17 lines corresponding to the 17 lines of the inscription, the first 16 translated into careful English, the 17th left blank. The translations were dense and strange and did not read like any language Callum had published in his academic work. They read like something between poetry and mathematics, precise but not propositional, each line doing something to the reader rather than simply telling them something. The linguists who have studied this partial translation since his disappearance have described it as extraordinary. A translation that appears to preserve not just the semantic content of the original but its operational quality, its capacity to produce an effect in the reader. Several of the researchers who have worked extensively with the translation have reported, with varying degrees of reluctance, that reading it produced an experience they found difficult to characterize. A sense of something opening, a feeling of standing at the edge of a very large space. One researcher, a 60-year-old professor from the Max Planck Institute, submitted his analysis and then took an indefinite leave of absence from his position. He has not returned. The 17th line was blank. Callum had translated 16 lines and stopped. Whether he stopped because he ran out of time, or because the 17th line resisted translation, or because he chose not to write it down, chose to keep it inside himself in the only place it belonged in the reader who had let it change them, is not known. The fourth thing he left was simpler and more devastating than any of the others. His wedding ring, placed on the desk beside the notebook with the careful deliberateness of someone setting something down that they will not need to pick up again. Not discarding it, not leaving it behind in carelessness or haste, but placing it with the full attention of a final gesture. The ring was plain gold, worn thin on the inside from 40 years of being worn against a hand. Callum had not removed it since Miriam died. Eleanor confirmed this. He had not removed it even in the hospital at the end, when the nurses had asked him to. He removed it for this. Part 8. The Search and What It Found. The search for Callum Reid was extensive by any measure. West Mercia police conducted a full missing persons investigation. His disappearance attracted significant academic and media attention. A distinguished professor vanishing from a locked hotel room in a market town in Shropshire is not the kind of event that goes unnoticed, and the writing on the wall of room 7 ensured that the story acquired a quality of mystery that drove sustained coverage. The physical search found nothing. No body, no clothing, no trace. The forensic examination of room 7 found nothing inconsistent with the account already established. Callum had been in the room, had worked through the night, and was gone by morning, with no physical evidence of how he had gone. The forensic team, somewhat to their own bewilderment, described the room as having the quality of a space that had been very carefully and deliberately vacated rather than one from which a person had unexpectedly disappeared. Everything in its place. Everything settled. The atmosphere, said one officer in her personal notes rather than her formal report, of a room where something had been completed. The academic investigation was more productive in the sense that it produced more information, and less productive in the sense that the information consistently declined to resolve into an explanation. The inscription in room 7 was dated, analyzed, compared, and ultimately filed in a category that the British Museum's conservator described, with professional discomfort, as without parallel in the known corpus. A building archaeologist who examined the structure of the hotel identified the section of wall containing the inscription as part of a significantly older building. A structure that predated the current hotel by at least 4 centuries, possibly more, and which had itself been built on an earlier foundation whose date could not be precisely determined. Someone had written on that wall in the medieval period or earlier, and subsequent builders had incorporated the wall into their own structure, unknowingly or otherwise, and plastered over it and wallpapered over it and waited for someone to come along and strip the paper back. The question of who wrote the inscription, who possessed, in medieval Shropshire, a complete example of a writing system that belongs to no known tradition and predates by centuries any other writing known from the region, is unanswerable with current knowledge. What is answerable barely is the question of intent. The inscription was clearly not casual. Its density, its organization, its completeness, the evidence of a single extended, uninterrupted sitting. These are the marks of an act of preservation. Someone wrote this down so that it would survive. Someone hid it in a wall so that it would be protected. Someone chose a location that was, presumably, expected to remain standing for a long time. It has remained standing for 700 years. It waited. It was found. It was read. And the reader went where readers of it apparently go. Part 9. Eleanor. Eleanor Reed is 34 years old. She is a translator. She works with literary texts, primarily moving between French and English, and she is good at it in the way that people who grow up in houses full of language tend to be good at it. Instinctively, physically, with a sense of how meaning moves between systems that goes beyond technique into something more like feel. She has her father's rigor. She has his curiosity. She is also, by her own account, deeply and permanently angry about what happened to him, which she distinguishes carefully from grief. Grief is for people who are gone, she told the journalist who wrote the most thorough account of the case. I'm not sure he's gone. I'm not sure what he is. I'm angry because he didn't tell me what he'd found before whatever happened. I'm angry because there's a partial translation sitting in a police evidence file and nobody will let me see it. I'm angry because the 17th line is blank and I think he knew what it said and he chose not to write it down and that was his decision to make and I respect it and it makes me furious. She paused. The linguists who have studied this partial translation since his disappearance have described it as extraordinary. A translation that appears to preserve not just the semantic content of the original but its operational quality, its capacity to produce an effect in the reader. Several of the researchers who have worked extensively with the translation have reported, with varying degrees of reluctance, that reading it produced an experience they found difficult to characterize. A sense of something opening, a feeling of standing at the edge of a very large space. One researcher, a 60-year-old professor from the Max Planck Institute, submitted his analysis and then took an indefinite leave of absence from his position. He has not returned. The 17th line was blank. Callum had translated 16 lines and stopped. Whether he stopped because he ran out of time, or because the 17th line resisted translation, or because he chose not to write it down, chose to keep it inside himself in the only place it belonged in the reader who had let it change them, is not known. The fourth thing he left was simpler and more devastating than any of the others. His wedding ring, placed on the desk beside the notebook with the careful deliberateness of someone setting something down that they will not need to pick up again. Not discarding it, not leaving it behind in carelessness or haste, but placing it with the full attention of a final gesture. The ring was plain gold, worn thin on the inside from 40 years of being worn against a hand. Callum had not removed it since Miriam died. Eleanor confirmed this. He had not removed it even in the hospital at the end, when the nurses had asked him to. He removed it for this. Part 8. The search and what it found. The search for Callum Reid was extensive by any measure. West Mercia police conducted a full missing persons investigation. His disappearance attracted significant academic and media attention. A distinguished professor vanishing from a locked hotel room in a market town in Shropshire is not the kind of event that goes unnoticed, and the writing on the wall of room 7 ensured that the story acquired a quality of mystery that drove sustained coverage. The physical search found nothing. No body, no clothing, no trace. The forensic examination of room 7 found nothing inconsistent with the account already established. Callum had been in the room, had worked through the night, and was gone by morning, with no physical evidence of how he had gone. The forensic team, somewhat to their own bewilderment, described the room as having the quality of a space that had been very carefully and deliberately vacated rather than one from which a person had unexpectedly disappeared. Everything in its place. Everything settled. The atmosphere, said one officer in her personal notes rather than her formal report, of a room where something had been completed. The academic investigation was more productive in the sense that it produced more information, and less productive in the sense that the information consistently declined to resolve into an explanation. The inscription in room 7 was dated, analyzed, compared, and ultimately filed in a category that the British Museum's conservator described, with professional discomfort, as without parallel in the known corpus. A building archaeologist who examined the structure of the hotel identified the section of wall containing the inscription as part of a significantly older building. A structure that predated the current hotel by at least 4 centuries, possibly more, and which had itself been built on an earlier foundation whose date could not be precisely determined. Someone had written on that wall in the medieval period or earlier, and subsequent builders had incorporated the wall into their own structure, unknowingly or otherwise, and plastered over it and wallpapered over it and waited for someone to come along and strip the paper back. The question of who wrote the inscription, who possessed, in medieval Shropshire, a complete example of a writing system that belongs to no known tradition and predates by centuries any other writing known from the region, is unanswerable with current knowledge. What is answerable barely is the question of intent. The inscription was clearly not casual. Its density, its organization, its completeness, the evidence of a single extended, uninterrupted sitting. These are the marks of an act of preservation. Someone wrote this down so that it would survive. Someone hid it in a wall so that it would be protected. Someone chose a location that was, presumably, expected to remain standing for a long time. It has remained standing for 700 years. It waited. It was found. It was read. And the reader went where readers of it apparently go. Part 9. Eleanor. Eleanor Reid is 34 years old. She is a translator. She works with literary texts, primarily moving between French and English, and she is good at it in the way that people who grow up in houses full of language tend to be good at it. Instinctively, physically, with a sense of how meaning moves between systems that goes beyond technique into something more like feel. She has her father's rigor. She has his curiosity. She is also, by her own account, deeply and permanently angry about what happened to him, which she distinguishes carefully from grief. Grief is for people who are gone, she told the journalist who wrote the most thorough account of the case. I'm not sure he's gone. I'm not sure what he is. I'm angry because he didn't tell me what he'd found before whatever happened. I'm angry because there's a partial translation sitting in a police evidence file and nobody will let me see it. I'm angry because the 17th line is blank and I think he knew what it said and he chose not to write it down and that was his decision to make and I respect it and it makes me furious. She paused. He left his wedding ring. He left it on purpose. He's been wearing that ring since he was 26 years old. He left it because he was going somewhere you don't need a wedding ring. Not because the marriage didn't matter. It mattered more than anything, his whole life. But because whatever he was going toward was somewhere where the things that matter here are not lesser. Just different. Just differently held. She looked at the window. He sent me a message. Unsent, technically, but it was meant for me. He knew someone would find it. He said, "Don't worry." He said he understood something now. He said he could see what my mother saw at the end. She was quiet for a moment. My mother was not afraid to die. She was genuinely, completely not afraid. I watched her, and I thought, that's either the most tragic thing, a person so broken by illness that the fear is gone, or it's the most extraordinary thing, a person who has seen something that makes the fear unnecessary. My father spent 4 years deciding which one it was. She looked back at the journalist. I think room 7 showed him. Part 10. What a language can do. Let us be precise, because precision is the tribute we owe to a man who spent his life in its service. Callum Reid is missing. He has been missing for over 2 years. His body has not been found. The room from which he disappeared has been examined by multiple forensic teams and has yielded no physical evidence of the mechanism of his disappearance. The door did not open. The windows were latched. The CCTV corridor footage for the relevant period shows an empty hallway and a closed door. The rational explanations exist and they are owed their moment. A man in his mid-60s, alone in a hotel room, could have experienced a medical event. A stroke, a cardiac event, a sudden catastrophic neurological failure. Such events can be rapid and can leave a room looking undisturbed. The body, in such cases, is sometimes not immediately obvious. People have been found in unexpected positions, in bathrooms or closets or behind furniture, missed on initial search. Except that room 7 was thoroughly searched multiple times by multiple teams and contained no body. The windows were latched from inside, which makes an exit through them difficult to account for, but not impossible. A person in a dissociative or delirious state might latch a window after climbing through it, might not. The door, with its specific lock mechanism, makes an exit through it without unlocking it from inside essentially mechanically impossible. But essentially is not the same as actually. And then there is the less rational territory, which the evidence keeps pointing toward regardless of how many times you try to redirect it. A man who spent 31 years studying language found a complete example of a writing system that has no known origin, no known tradition, no parallel in the entire recorded history of human inscription. He spent 2 days analyzing it. He wrote a partial translation that multiple researchers have described as producing an effect in the reader. Not a metaphorical effect, not an emotional response to interesting prose, but something operational, something that does something to the person who reads it. He wrote that the text knew it was being read. He wrote that it read him back. He wrote that the 17th line was a threshold. He crossed the threshold. He left his ring. He left his daughter a message that said, "Don't worry." And the writing is still on the wall of room 7, 17th line and all, in a script that no one else has yet been able to fully read. Because, and this is the part that the Max Planck Institute researcher who took indefinite leave of absence could not bring himself to publish, but said privately to a colleague who said it privately to Eleanor who said it to the journalist who is writing this. Because reading the text changes the reader in a way that makes it impossible to read it again. Because the text requires a reader who has not yet encountered it. Because once you have read it, you are no longer the person who can read it. The reading uses you up. And the next reader has to come fresh to it, has to bring their whole unread self to those 17 lines on a plastered wall in a hotel room in Shropshire. Callum Reid read it once. Then he went through. What is on the other side is not written in room 7, because you cannot write the other side of a door on the door itself. But Callum Reid knows. Wherever he is, whatever he became when the 17th line finished what the first 16 had prepared, he knows. He crossed 31 years of preparation in a single night in a room above a pub in the English Midlands, and he went somewhere that his wife had already seen from the far edge of her life and had not been afraid of. And he left his wedding ring on the desk with the care of someone who knows they will not need it where they are going but cannot leave without placing it down deliberately, with love, in the last room of the life they are finishing. Epilogue, the 17th line. Room 7 at the Aldersham Hotel is still available to book. James and Patricia Hollowell considered briefly closing it, making it off-limits the way hotels sometimes retire rooms with difficult histories. They decided against it, for reasons they have described as practical but which seem, in the telling, to be something else. They decided against it because the room does not feel like a place where something bad happened. It feels, Patricia said, like a place where something was completed. And you do not close a room because something was completed in it. The inscription is still on the wall. The plaster has been preserved. The writing is there if you look for the section beside the fireplace where the newer plaster begins, where Margaret Ellison's hands found the edge of the old paper lifting in the autumn of 2022 and pulled it back and found, beneath everything, the thing that had been waiting. The partial translation exists in the police evidence file and in copies held by 4 academic institutions. The 16 translated lines are available to researchers with appropriate access controls. The 17th line is blank on every copy. But the 17th line is not blank on the wall. It is there, complete. The last symbol in a sequence that begins somewhere in the high medieval period and ends wherever Callum Reid is now. It is there, patient and old and specific, waiting for the next person who has prepared themselves enough. 30 years, 40 years, a lifetime of following language to its edges, to stand in front of it and let it read them back. Eleanor Reid has not gone to Aldersham. She has been asked by researchers and journalists whether she intends to. She always gives the same answer.